Welcome back to The Urban Monk. Dr. Pedram Shojai here with a very interesting subject today, looking at the final words we speak before we pass. My guest today, Lisa Smartt, had an experience with her father, and she started to really recognize how certain elements of his language were changing in his final days, and so she started what's called the Final Word Project. And so she's a linguist, an educator, and a poet, studied in Berkeley, and has really devoted her time to looking at these final words and what meaning we can pull out and what significance there is in understanding what happens there. So hi, welcome to the show.
Hey, hello there.
Hi, so talk to me about what happened with your father and what kind of inspired this and how you got in.
My father was one of those people who was a complete skeptic and rationalist. And he used to joke and say that his idea of God was like a corned beef sandwich with coleslaw on the side, and that was where God began and ended for him. And he didn't believe there was anything beyond what we think of as this world. And yet in those last 3 weeks as he was dying, he started referring to angels in the corner of the room. 3 days before he died, he announced that the angel said, "Enough, enough. The angels say enough, only 3 days left." And indeed, 3 days later, he passed away. So one of the most startling things, of course, I noticed was a man who was a hardcore skeptic who believed there was nothing beyond this world started speaking about angels in his room while he was dying. So that was a piece of what caught my eye, and then just many other patterns in the language over those 3 weeks I found really compelling.
Wow, were you able to communicate with him about that, or was he kind of more lucid and not able to really kind of reconcile the worlds?
That's a really, really great question. I think we did in some ways communicate about it, but I was so stunned and awed about what I saw. I almost couldn't find the language to communicate with him. And in a sense, this whole book has been an exploration, almost my own regret about not having the vocabulary and the language to bridge that divide between my father and me. So, in some ways I feel like I didn't connect with him the way I wish I had. And that's part of what led me to do the research I did.
So you partnered up with Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote he wrote a book called Life After Life. And you came to him with this and said, "Hey, listen, I'm doing this thing. Would you join me? Is this a new quest?" Like, how did that partnership happen?
It was a little bit more kind of almost magical than that. After my father passed away, I went up to the library, the linguistics library in Berkeley, to see what had been written about the language at end of life, thinking there was tons of stuff written, assuming that what I witnessed was something that had been studied before, because as a linguist, I know the language of children and infants has been studied massively, right? There's lots. So I just assumed it was the same for end of life. And when I went there was almost nothing about the patterns and themes of language when people are dying. So I just started reading everything I could, and I came across Raymond's book that I had read when I was 17, when the word near-death experience first became part of our cultural vocabulary. And I reread the book, and I just thought, wow, I would love to meet this man. And synchronistically, a friend of my mother's had told her that he was teaching a class with Raymond in Alabama in a few weeks. And so I thought, oh my gosh, that'd be amazing to go meet Dr. Moody and learn from him. And then another synchronicity, a few days later, I received a $2,000 tax refund in the mail, and I definitely took that as a sign to just hop on that plane and meet Raymond Moody. And as I went through his workshop, I really had no intention at this time of doing final words research. I was still in that kind of period of inquiry. And then on the fourth day, Raymond started speaking about his earlier work. Before he became a MD, he was a PhD in philosophy, and he specialized in unintelligible language, the language that doesn't make sense to us. And he loved, for example, Lewis Carroll and paradoxical language. So he mentioned that, and then I said, wow, that's the kind of language I saw in my father as he was passing on. And so we just had a conversation, and not much later, I moved from California, sold everything I owned, quit my job, and decided that there was this passion in me to pursue final words and to work with Raymond Moody.
So when you're pursuing final words, what does that look like? Like, hey, can I hang out like in your hospice? So yeah, where do you get your data on this?
It was tricky because those last few days of life or weeks of life are very fragile and personal, and I feel sacred times. And so what I did is I just began having conversations with people, and I went to hospices. And I'll tell you, the internet has been remarkable because I established the Final Words Project, and I have a submission form, and people can just submit their accounts, and then I would follow up with phone calls. I did go to hospices. Some were more open to the idea of sharing transcripts. Others were not that comfortable, and I fully understood that that a lot of this language is very private. So it was hard to get started, but once the word spread, I was able to begin to collect data. And hospice nurses are really remarkable, and a lot of them spent time speaking with me and sharing accounts with me in ways that were confidential and honored the privacy of the patients.
Sure. Just to know personally here, was it all old people, or you got people that were terminally ill in younger years? Like, who's your sample population?
Probably there's a range. There's a range of ages. One of the hospice nurses I worked most closely with specialized in children. So there's a fair amount of samples from her. But I would still say it's probably weighted towards older folks in hospice. And, end of life, having lived a full life, at least 60 years or older. But not everyone. Not everyone.
How did you distinguish? Because I mean, nowadays everyone's so doped up, right? And so the medications are, given a little too freely. And so, I remember this with my grandmother. It was just, how much of this is coherent and how much of this is just, like a drunken slur coming from a cocktail of drugs. How do you distinguish that?
Well, I had a long conversation with Raymond Moody when we first began this, because I thought, well, we can't really do this research without controlling for medications. Raymond, he said, no, 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 no. No, what you do is you see what patterns emerge no matter what's going on. You don't control. And that's what he did with near-death experiences, because you see the near-death experience happen across illnesses and medications. And he said, for this first time around, this is the first time this research has been done, you're not in a position to really control. I wasn't involved with an academic institution anyway. He said, let's just see if there are patterns that emerge across medications and diagnoses. And guess what? There were. So the very kinds of patterns that you maybe have referenced when you heard and you thought, oh, it's just word salad or delirium. Well, if you hear it one time in someone you love, you just say, oh, that's just the meds. But when you start seeing patterns that no matter what meds someone is taking, or whether they're taking no meds at all, and you start seeing the same metaphors, the same types of nonsense or, paradoxical, unusual language, and you go, wait a minute, if it's happening across the board, then maybe there is something else going on here. And that's, of course, what we began to wonder as we collected the data.
So you analyzed over 1,500, from what I'm gathering here, end-of-life phrases. What are the patterns? What did you start to see? What were the commonalities? What are we learning in these phrases at the end of our lives?
Yes, that's a great question. I just want to let you know we're up to about 2,000 now. So a lot of the patterns we found, there's even more kind of data to support these patterns. The first has been written about before, and that's the increase in metaphoric language. And there are three things we notice in these metaphors. One is that their metaphor is true to the person's life. So if someone, one example, someone was a roofing contractor, and he loved his job. And just before he was dying, he said to his daughter, oh my God, it's amazing over there. There's so many remodels to be done. There are kitchenettes and kitchenettes to be done, right? So he was talking about this place he was going to using sort of the life story and the symbols that mattered to him. Or Jeffrey Holder, who was a dancer, as he was dying, the very last words were something like 1, 2, 3, down, 2, turned 1, 2, or something, but using the language of dance. So oftentimes people's very final words are very closely connected to their life stories. So that's one piece. The other piece, the metaphors we see are about travel. We hear people talking about the trains coming or packing their suitcases or in search of passports or, my dental hygienist, her grandmother talked about the yellow bus with the angels on it, right? Because she was a believer in angels. And so her bus had angels on it. So we see metaphors related to travels. And then finally, we hear about some kind of big event coming. And that was something that was really compelling to me. My father's language is that a few weeks before he died, he announced the big art show, this big art show that he was bringing boxes to. Well, there was no art show, and he had no boxes in his hands, but it was a metaphor for his approaching death. So that's one of the patterns. Should I say more?
Well, what I find compelling here is that your father didn't believe in angels and he saw them, right? How does one explain
Right.
that?
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, and that's why I quit a really good job and lived off the savings and moved to Georgia um, to do this research. And I felt this kind of just a driving passion because I felt like I had witnessed something that hospice nurses will tell you they've seen over the years, right? And it is becoming more mainstream knowledge. For example, if you look at WebMD, they will say, oftentimes people at end of life may have hallucinations of deceased relatives, for example, which is a very common thing, very, very frequent. Before people leave, they'll start having conversations with people who passed on before them and very lucid, and they can move in and out of those conversations. Honey, pass me the orange juice. I'm talking to Earl, and Earl had just passed away. So, we see this remarkable unseen world that is just more and more becoming becoming mainstream knowledge. So it's been a very compelling 5 years for me because it's not that I was as much of a rationalist as my father, but I had no idea that this kind of rich world lived at the threshold. But no one's taken the time to really look at the language because so many people had the kind of your experience you did, where you hear something that just sounds like word salad, and if you have no context for that, well, of course you're going to think, oh, it's just those medications. But when you start looking at things systematically and the patterns emerge, it's remarkable.
What were some of the most fascinating things that you discovered in this? I mean, there's obviously a lot of data now in your database alone. What was it that, what were the head scratchers? What were the things that you were like, damn, that's serious, that's deep?
I think one of the things is something called terminal lucidity, where someone could be completely unresponsive for a period of time, and then just before that person dies, there'll be sometimes literally a glow about them. And they'll come up out of being completely unresponsive and speak lucidly to the people around them. So someone may say something like, it's not what you think, and then go back into their coma and die. Or one of the most dramatic cases was a man's mother who had Alzheimer's and then was in a coma. She got up a few days before she died and told him where all the financial files were kept, so that he wouldn't have difficulty making sense of things after she died, which I just find amazing that could happen. And so that the idea of terminal lucidity, where we see complete unresponsiveness and this window of time, anywhere from maybe 15 minutes to sometimes maybe even a day, where people have all of a sudden heightened lucidity. And maybe this maybe is not that surprising, but in that window of time, no one looks at their loved one and says, God, you've been a crappy son. No one says the words that people say in that window of lucidity are always words of, I never told you that I loved you. Or, one case is this woman had a father-in-law who always told her, kind of made fun of her being short and chubby and was kind of mean-spirited. And he said to her, oh my God, I never realized how beautiful you are, right, just before he passed. So I think terminal lucidity really I found remarkable. And one other thing I found remarkable is that if you look at the language of the dying, someone may start 3 weeks before they die making references to the train coming, and they need their suitcase. Okay, 3 weeks before they die. And then over a period of time in this semi-lucid state, they'll keep making references to the trains coming closer, and the bag is packed, and now they need their passport. And there's this, what I call a sustained narrative over 3 weeks that they are able to remember and keep telling, well, could you remember what you said to someone 3 weeks ago? And sustain that over three. So that's another thing that I found really, really remarkable.
So the implications here can be either read into too far or are actually really more far-reaching than the research can point to. Is what is this consciousness, right? Like what is happening in this moment? What is this gateway, and are they actually seeing another world? How much of that did you see? How much evidence of that, quote unquote? Because I've read a lot of the near-death stuff. I've done some out-of-body work myself. But there are, you got 2,000 cases of people crossing over here.
Or utterances. There are utterances in not cases. I just want to make sure. But
got it.
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of evidence to me, and many of them have to do with these visitors that come to take people away before they pass on. And you hear so many people describe this beautiful world in this other dimension, and it's just hard. I mean, what it looks like to me is that we're somehow wired to have these really remarkable visions before we die. Now, I guess the argument could be, well, somehow we're just wired that way. But so we're wired to make death easier for us? Well, that seems counterintuitive to what we know about biological programming, which is all about survival of the fittest, right, or survival. So somehow, though, I really, from what I saw, I even heard stories of people who were in comas and later came out of them, that they were much more conscious than we ever imagined while they were in a coma. So there seems to be this thing, which is, the I or the me that transcends language or certain types of language and certain physical states. So, I couldn't say to you, I could tell you for 1,000% that there's an afterlife, because I think it's all much more mysterious than that, and I think it's probably way bigger than what I could even imagine. But there is something going on, and that indicates to me that consciousness in some way survives.
So J.R.R. Tolkien was a master linguist, right? One of my favorite authors of all time. As a linguist, when you start deconstructing language and understanding, the sense of self, the I, and the kind of the frame of reference that orientation revolves around, how much of that shifts? Because I remember my grandma started talking like a child again, and it became very, very different form of syntax.
Oh, great. Oh, I wish I had that transcript. That sounds really interesting. Yes, no, I think so. Matter of fact, I had one person I thought was so interesting. She said, the pronoun isn't right. The pronoun is all wrong. Before she passed away, I thought that was interesting, the pronoun. And so was that the I she was talking about? But yeah, we definitely, well, one of the things that I see is people refer to this a lot, like there's this non-referential language. So, for example, my father said, this is very interesting. I've never done this before, right? So we have no idea what this is and who he is in relationship to this. So it definitely seems that one sense of self and how people refer to the world changes. So what I mean about this is right before my father died, he was talking to his secretary on the phone. He said, Alice, this is very interesting. I've never done this before. And I was wondering, what is this? And I wish now, going back in time, I wish I had said, Daddy, what is this? What is this you're talking about? And who is the who's talking about it? So it's, when you see an abundance of non-referential language. For example, Roger Ebert, who was a film critic, who you may recall, said to his wife, or wrote down right before he passed away, I think it was something like, it's all an elaborate hoax, right? So what's the it's, and what's the this, and who's the I? And yeah, you ask a great question, and it definitely is very, it piqued my curiosity as I looked at the phrases that people said, definitely. But who is the I?
who is this I experiencing this? I mean, these are big questions that we don't, it's one of these things that we did in our next movie, and it was a fascinating exercise for me because we're doing this movie about conscious capitalism, and then we just kind of came back and started asking people, what is money, right? And then we started asking children, what is money? And we just started digging deeper and deeper, because these things that like are assumptions that we base everything off of, we build our language on an assumption that we understand what this thing means. And if we haven't really examined the core of the base of the language, everything that extrapolates from out of that just gets further and further from reality, right? And so when you're in that position, you're on your deathbed, that things don't get more real than that, right? You're crossing over, you cut the bullshit, and you're in it, right? You're in it. If you are in a position where someone in your life is on that threshold and they're passing, what recommendation would you give them? Do you audio record? Do you ask specific questions? How do you tease out and kind of get a little bit more access to this space respectfully while you can?
Yeah, I think definitely just listening closely. Digital recorders, recording them is a mixed bag. I think at first the scientist in me, when I went into this research, I was like, well, yes, tape record everything. But I think, how in some cultures they ask people not to take photographs because it seems to take the soul away. I almost have that feeling a little bit about the language of the threshold, though it might be almost superstitious. So I think there's something about writing it down, because when you really write down what people are saying, there's something very kinesthetic about it. It almost feels like you're entering in with them in a certain kind of way that allows you to be really, really present with them. And I think just listening closely. And I just got a story this morning in my email, and someone shared how her partner was dying. And her partner had said, "Mama train, mama train, mama train. I need to get on the mama train." And she was really agitated. And everyone's like, "What is she talking about? What are we going to do?" And her partner just got next to her and said, "Okay, we're going on the mama train. We're going on the mama train. We're going on the mama train. Now, here we go. Choo, choo, mama train," And suddenly her loved one just completely relaxed with it. So I think if we really listen closely and step into the metaphors and even what sounds like nonsense and somehow engage with it, and assume it's sacred. What harm is there in assuming it's sacred? Because you can assume, oh, it's those darn medications and my mom's losing it, right? Or you can assume, hey, there's something sacred going on here, and I want to find a way to meet it and be present with it. And I think when you do that, a magic and an alchemy occurs. And so that's one, few suggestions for how to be more engaged and more present.
So where you so the book is called Words at the Threshold: What We Say as We're Nearing Death by Lisa Smartt, double T at the end. Where is this taking you now? Like how do you want to continue this research? I mean, is this something that you're just still playing in?
Yeah, it just keeps expanding. So one of the areas that was a natural growth from the book is I interviewed people who are psychics and mediums and how they got their information. And I was really intrigued by that, because a lot of what we're seeing in the dying seems to be another kind of language that becomes increasingly symbolic and nonsensical. And what I found as I spoke to psychics and mediums is many of them get their best information in nonsensical form, in a form that doesn't make sense to the left brain, as they say. So, I'm very intrigued by how we get maybe, for lack of a better word, divine inspiration, or inspiration from another realm, because it can help in curing illness, it can help in loving others, and I'm really intrigued by, and it could also help in making great art, right? So I'm really intrigued by the notion of this highly symbolic world that lives within us, that is not always the realm that we live in our ordinary lives. For example, synchronicities, how certain symbols start emerging in our lives. So I'm really intrigued by that. And one of the people I interviewed is William Stillman, who has Asperger's and has written, I think, 12 books on autism. And what he found in his research is a very, very high percentage of his autistic clients were highly precognitive and psychic, and they were living in this very kind of nonverbal consciousness that was very visual. So that's, I think, one of the things I'm really finding. Nonverbal versus verbal consciousness. I'm really intrigued by that.
So I don't know if you know the work of Rick Strassman, but he was looking at dimethyltryptamine, and so the highest concentration bursts of DMT are, upon birth and upon death, so that near-death experiences and all that. And then you have all these ayahuasqueros and people using substances to approximate this. But, a lot of people talk about this threshold, right? This space. A lot of people have navigated these waters just, under different sets of rules. But the data is pretty consistent and interesting. It's very metaphoric. This uses a lot of, imagery and visuals that are hard to put into words, because it is precognitive, but it's fascinating stuff. I'm so happy to be seeing all this research happening around these inflection points in life. And listen, I wish you the best with this. I want you to continue this work selfishly, because I want to know, you know what I mean? Like, I want to know what's coming out of it, because it means something for the rest of us. And then the question becomes, now knowing what you know, how are you living your life differently, looking at the end, looking at this precipice, and where these people are transitioning? Has it shifted the way you're living life? And are you stopping to smell the flowers? Like, how are you different?
I'm much less afraid of dying. I used to be one of those people who was terrified of getting on airplanes, and I don't feel that way at all. I mean, I feel really that there's some. I've spoken to a lot of people with near-death experiences, and I'm really convinced, if nothing else, it does seem we're programmed to somehow try to make peace with our dying, and I just feel much less afraid of dying, which of course makes me less afraid of living. And I also feel much more connected to that still small voice, and my intuition has really deepened, and I've learned to trust it. And there's been so much more synchronicity in my life since I went on this path. And okay, so I lived off of my savings for 4 or 5 years, right? But I have a kind of faith that everything's going to work out. So there really is a greater faith in that still small voice. And I'm really grateful to my father for leaving his voice behind so that I could discover mine in that way.
Totally. You've been following the breadcrumbs ever siness. And this is a great journey. It's a great journey. It's meaningful work. So thank you. Lisa Smartt, Words at the Threshold. I really enjoy these types of conversations. She's delightful, and I'm glad you stopped and took the time out to do this. Let me know what you think in the chat threads. We will be following up on this. Hopefully when you get to 10,000 phrases and you're still going, I want to know what this is all about. And again, wishing you the best of luck. Let me know what you think. Dr. Pedram Shojai, the Urban Monk.